The sun has gone down at Hangman's Hill, and the ghost at Misery Corner isn't walking tonight. So, welcome to Urban Fantasies, your fortnightly fix of weird tales, urban legends, magic, and folklore. And now here's your host, writer, award-winning journalist, best-selling author, and sometime werewolf hunter, Charles Christian.
It's Thursday night, it's late, this is our 7th show, so hello to you in paranormal Radioland. I'm Charles Christian, and with me is Janie.
Hi, and tonight we have another busy show with 3 fascinating interviews on ghost stories, haunted house movies, and the sad tale of the Lowestoft witches. And I expect Charles is going to start us off with a sad story about a sad ghost. Is that right?
Afraid so. Tonight's ghost doesn't manifest at a specific date, but you just might encounter her if you're walking through Haig Woods. This is just outside Wigan in Lancashire, in the north of England. The ghost is that of Lady Mabel Norris, and she is said to walk from Haig Hall, where she used to live, to Standisgate Cross, just by Wigan's north wall. Cross is now called Mab's Cross. The story is Mabel married a knight called Sir William Bradshaw some point in the early 14th century. However, he went off to fight either in a crusade or else on a pilgrimage to the Holy Land. The details are a little vague, as they often are in these stories. Anyway, he didn't return for 10 years. During this time, Lady Mabel, thinking he was dead, remarried, this time to a Welsh knight, which meant she had unwittingly committed the crime and sin of bigamy. But eventually Sir William did return, in disguise as a pilgrim. Now Lady Mabel saw him, and because she reminded him of her first husband, at this point, it's worth noting, she hadn't realised it actually was her husband, and she began weeping. Her new husband asked her what the matter was. When she told him she was crying for a lost husband, he hit her. In dramatic style, the disguised pilgrim suddenly reveals that he really is the long-lost Sir William, whereupon the wife-beating Welshman hops onto his horse and gallops away, closely followed by Sir William, who catches him up within the local deer park and kills him.
And then they all lived happily ever after?
No. Sir William himself gets killed about 10 years later in a feud with the Earl of Lancaster. As for poor Lady Mabel, because she had unwittingly committed the crime and sin of bigamy, she was required to do penance by walking barefoot once a week, every week, from Haig Hall to the Standisgate Cross and back again, about 6 miles in total. She did this for the rest of her life. In fact, the legend says she actually died while doing her walk of shame.
So let me get this straight. Her husband disappears for 10 years to the Holy Land. He doesn't write. He doesn't ring to find out if she is all right. And she is the one that gets blamed for thinking he's dead and trying to get on with her own life.
And it gets worse, as basically 800 years later, her ghost, also known as the Walker in the Woods and the White Lady, is still carrying out her penance, walking her walk of shame.
I'm getting quite angry on her behalf, poor old girl.
Don't feel too sorry for the ghost. In fact, feel sorry for the people who see her ghost. Her ghost is said to appear as a thin, forlorn figure, walking barefoot and wearing ragged robes and a cowl. However, anyone who sees her face will, according to the story, go stark staring mad. Basically, because she doesn't have a face. The last reported sighting on this stretch was about 1979 when a young man encountered her in the woods. He was taken into a nearby pub called the Saracen's Head as a nervous wreck. Apparently it took paramedics an hour to get any sense out of him.
I've been looking her up, actually, while I've been talking, and it seems the writer Paul Finch reported this conversation with one of the men who used to work as a gardener on the Haig Hall estate. Can I do this in an accent?
Go on, yes.
Okay. You must never look at her face. That's what we was warned about. She walks through the grounds, usually from around twilight onwards, just about the time when we'd be knocking off and setting off home through the woods. She's covered in rags and dirt, but you must never look in her face. She hasn't got one. And to see that empty space with no human features is said to drive you mad. At least that's what we were told.
Brilliant. There's nothing better at Christmas than a nice ghost story. So we're going now to be talking to Willie Meikle. He's a writer of ghost stories and horror stories, and he's got a new book out called The Ghost Club. Right, Willie, your new book, The Ghost Club. Now, it's a collection of, you put it as newly found Victorian tales of terror. Can you tell me a little bit more about it and the thinking behind it?
It started with a Facebook conversation with a couple of British Sherlock Holmes fans. We were talking about writing pastiches, and somebody said, have you ever thought about doing an H. Rider Haggard one? And I thought, well, no, I haven't, but now I have. And I got the idea of writing a sequel to She in my head, but that never came to anything. But once I had the idea of Haggard and Doyle talking to each other, all sorts of other people started coming in and talking to them as well. And I got the idea that Doyle and a couple of his friends had a dining club in London, and they invited people over to tell them a story. And after that, it just sort of grew into who could I get to come and talk to Doyle and tell him stories, and who would I want to write a story in the style of. After that, I had to do some research to make sure everybody I wanted to be coming to tell stories was still alive, because I wanted Dickens in there, but then I realised that he was far too dead to be there.
What's the date you've got set?
Ranges from about 1894 up to the early part of the 1900s. So it covers a range of 5 or 6 years, just so I could get everybody in, because I wanted, in particular, I wanted H.G. Wells in there, but he was very young at the time. So I've had to do a bit of hand-waving to get him in there as a youngster who's wanting to write stories and talking to Conan Doyle about being a writer, to get him to sort of shoehorn him in. And a couple of the other guys were getting a bit old for it as well, like Tolstoy. So I sort of played around with dates slightly to make sure I could get everybody in that I wanted in.
Yeah. On that, I mean, some of the people you've got in there are, if you like, who you'd expect. Rudyard Kipling, Robert Louis Stevenson, Bram Stoker, H.G. Wells and so on. But there's a few, if you like, slightly left field ones. You've got Anton Chekhov, Helena Blavatsky, Margaret Oliphant, who I must admit I'd never read of any of her stuff before, and as you say, Tolstoy. What's the thinking of bringing them in there?
It's a bit of pride on my part. I wanted to see if I could get them to tell ghost stories as much as anything else. In fact, I've read all of Tolstoy's work. I've read all of the Blavatsky spiritualism thing, and Mrs. Margaret Oliphant, my wife's got a lot of her books, and I hadn't read any of them. But then I found a book of her collected supernatural stories, and I found that she'd written some really good early late Victorian ghost stories. So once I got her in my head, I knew she was Scottish as well. So I thought, I'll add a Scots woman in there and get her voice added to the mix. Chekhov, I've always been a fan of Chekhov's plays, and some of his short stories appealed to me because I don't know what it is about Chekhov. There's a lot of the working man in Chekhov, a lot of people like railwaymen and dock workers and people that work on stalls and selling fruit. So I wanted to get some of the working man stories in there and amongst all these gentlemanly types as well. And Chekhov was the one that brought that in. Plus a lot of vodka drinking as well.
Yes. I mean, one thing that's intriguing is the way that you've imitated all their styles of writing. I mean, the Oscar Wilde one is brilliant. How long did it take you, or how much did you have to do to get into the zone to write that way? Because, say, you've got, 18 different authors and 18 entirely different styles there.
it started out. I did the easy ones first. Doyle's been in my head since I was a kid. I've always been able to sort of mimic Doyle in a way, because some of the earliest short stories I wrote were very Doylean. I was writing Challenger fan fiction back in the 1970s when I was a kid.
Yeah.
So Doyle's always been somebody that spoke to me anyway, so I could get him down. So I wrote the Doyle story, and I tried. Which one did I do second? I think it might have been the Twain I did second, because again, the slightly sarcastic voice of Twain is something that comes to me fairly naturally. But then I thought, I better do a hard one next. So I got to Tolstoy, and I realised I'd maybe bitten off more than I could chew. I read Anna Karenina. I read bits and pieces of other things. Then I sat down and tried to write a Tolstoy short story. 20 pages later, I was still writing about the palaces and the people and the glory of it all. And I thought, there's no plot here yet. So I had to back off on Tolstoy for a bit. But I got the basic rhythm of the language had come to me, and what I needed then was to get a person to tell the story. And luckily, there's a lot of Scotsmen went to Leningrad and worked selling timber and doing trade over in Russia. So I brought one of those Scottish trades to the story, and that gave me an entry point to get the rest of the story told, if you like. And after that went fairly smoothly after that, and I thought, if I can do Tolstoy, I can probably just about manage everybody. But it did mean a lot of reading. I read work by all of them, quite a lot of work by all of them. And thank you about the Wild one, because the Wild one was the one I was worried about. So I wasn't sure I'd got the voice quite right with the Wild one, but I went for light and frothy, and I think I pulled it off.
Yeah, I mean, it's got that style, reminding me immediately of his story, The Canterville Ghost, which is one of his underrated stories that people tend to forget he wrote, and that is such a good story, yes. And I say I really enjoyed yours and the sort of sarcastic ending of it. It was just perfect.
The other one I had trouble with was Verne, because getting this sort of dense scientific prose of Verne into it wasn't quite working for me. And with that one, the way I got into that one was thinking it more of as a Ray Harryhausen film as opposed to a Jules Verne short story.
Right, yes.
And once I got the rockets and the animation thing in my head, that story all came quite quickly after that. So I think getting in different voices, is a hard bit, but it was actually finding the person to tell the story to get me into it was the hardest bit. And some of them, finding the person who was telling the story was harder than others. But with Verne, I didn't even find a person at all. As I say, I found a style which was more like Harryhausen than Verne. But I think that one works quite well in the end as well.
The Scrimshaw set by Henry James, that was quite an unusual one, because James isn't one of my sort of go-to writers of that era, if you like. How did you find with him? Because, I mean, a lot of his stuff is more in the literary side of things rather than genre.
I was a big fan of The Turn of the Screw. I always have been of that story. That was one of the first supernatural, not supernatural or not stories I ever read. I remember reading it way back in the early, must have been 73, 74, something like that, so well over 40 years ago now. But with James, rereading James for me is a bit of a struggle sometimes, because his sentences get a bit too convoluted, and I have sometimes struggled to follow him. Again, finding my way into that story, I don't know if you've read the Dan Simmons book about James, The Fifth Part. Have you seen that one?
No, I haven't.
It's a Henry James meeting Sherlock Holmes book.
Right.
But Simmons goes into James in great detail in that book, and the voice Simmons used for James's conversational style was the one I picked up on for my story in that one. So that was my way into that story. It was less through James's writing, but more through the way I thought he might speak. Yeah. And I got that from that Dan Simmons book. I've borrowed that liberally. The chess set in the story comes from another hobby of mine. I've got lots of chess sets of my own, and I've been playing chess for many years. And I always wanted to write a haunted chess set story. That's my first one of those kinds.
Are there any authors of that era that, with hindsight, you think, I wish I'd have included them in there? Or
You know, there's people who were either too dead or too young. I'd like to have been able to shoehorn in. Jack London was one of them. I'd have loved to have written a Wild Yukon ghost story.
Yeah.
Like Jack London meets Algernon Blackwood's The Willows or something like that. Something similar to that.
Yeah.
Hector Munro, I'd like to run one of those, like doing a Saki story.
Oh, yes,
You know.
yes.
I also fancied wondering what Trollope might have done with a ghost story. So I was thinking about trying to shoehorn him in as well. And Wilkie Collins again, of course. So there's a few people. And then moving slightly further on into the Edwardian side, although I write a lot of Carnacki stories, Hodgson's not in there, and that's because he was too young.
Right.
And John Buchan, I'd like to have had a go at, but he was far too young at the time as well. Somebody on Facebook yesterday mentioned me, moving on 20 years, still having Conan Doyle there, but writing as another set of stories, the Edwardian ones.
Yeah.
I hadn't thought about that, but having that thought might not go away.
Yeah, well, if you did that, then you'd be perfectly placed to get someone like M.R. James in there as well.
A lot of them in there. Could get E.F. Benson in as well. That's getting into territory where I'm not sure I could handle it, so we'll have to see.
Yeah.
Stepping into too many greats then, I think.
Yeah. The book, what formats is it available in?
E-book and paperback.
It's so ebook and paperback, and when it goes on sale about now, isn't it?
It's up for order on Amazon at the moment. You can pre-order it on Amazon. The launch day is next Saturday, the 9th.
Right.
I'm going to be live on Facebook on video on the 9th myself, I think, reading bits of it.
Okay, well, that's great. It's been lovely talking to you, Willie, and best of luck with the book, and keep in touch and let us know when the sequel comes. Incidentally, if you're looking for Willie's books on Amazon, his surname is actually spelled Meikle.
You're listening to Urban Fantasist with Charles Christian on the Paranormal UK Radio Network.
Over to Janie now, who this week has been looking at some of the folklore surrounding calls.
A call, or cowl, and the Latin for that is caput galliatum, just in case you're interested, which means literally helmeted head. It's a piece of membrane that can cover a newborn's head and face. Birth with a caul is rare, occurring in fewer than 1 in 80,000 births. And for this reason, it's become the focus of a lot of intriguing folklore, the most common one being it must be kept for good luck, for whoever has one will never drown. In fact, they were so popular that at one time there was a thriving business in selling cauls to sailors and mariners. The peak was the end of the 18th century when newspapers were advertising them for as much as 30 guineas. That's the equivalent of nearly £2,500 today. According to some folklore, people born with a caul will become successful sorcerers, although in Romania the suspicion is that they will become vampires. Now, naturally, it was thought unlucky to lose or throw away a caul, as at the very least the person was likely to become a restless wanderer. Famous people born with cauls include Lord Byron, Sigmund Freud, Napoleon, Liberace, and the English comedy actress Hilda Baker.
And Charles Christian.
You were born with a caul. Do you still have it?
Of course not. My mother disposed of it at the time of my birth.
Ah, well, that explains quite a lot, doesn't it?
Hush. Did you hear it? It sounded like a floorboard creaking upstairs, but there's nobody upstairs. Was it the wind, or was it something else? Now, we all love a good haunted house movie, so who better than to tell us about it than Icy Sedgwick? She's doing a PhD on this very topic. She's also an author of dark fantasy and gothic stories, and her latest novel, The Necromancer's Apprentice, is available on Amazon as an ebook. OK, Icy, you're doing a PhD in haunted house films. What made you go for a topic like that?
Well, I mean, I've always loved haunted house films the most. Out of all the horror subgenres, it's always been my favourite. But it was when I was doing my MA, I was looking at the domestic space in horror cinema for my final dissertation. And then I was like, I really enjoyed that. I want to explore that more. So then when it came to formulating what I wanted to do my PhD in, there's been more of an explosion recently in books about hauntings, but quite a lot of them deal with like people being haunted by events or haunted by past trauma. So hauntings are used in a more psychological sense, whereas I'm looking at literal hauntings, and there's not really that much being done compared to other areas of horror. So I thought, well, I'll just do that then.
But when you say haunted house movies, presumably most of those are purely fictional. I mean, some of them are supposedly like the Amityville, based upon a real event.
It's surprising how many of them, and I'm blaming the Texas Chainsaw Massacre for this, it's amazing how many films have now got based on true events at the beginning. And I can only think of a handful where they are actually based on genuine documented cases. But I suppose obviously for those films, it's great for the extended features on the DVD because they invariably interview the family that was affected. And I mean, Amityville is probably one of the more famous ones. But then recently we've had When the Lights Go Out, which I think was a poltergeist. And I want to say it was Pontefract, but I could be wrong.
Yeah.
And then you've got the Enfield haunting that Sky did, and The Conjuring 2, about the haunting in Enfield as well. So there has been a tendency, I think, towards making fictional versions of real cases. But then again, you also get films at the opposite end of the spectrum. And I watched this the other day, The Haunting in Connecticut 2, Ghosts of Georgia, which is a really weird way of taking a franchise. And it was based on true events. But when you actually read or watch the interview with the family on the DVD, what they experienced had nothing to do with what they've actually put in the film. So to say based on true events, I mean, yeah, the people lived in a house. That's about as close as you can get to the true events. So it some of them are a bit odd like that. So in a way, I think it's because I'm only looking at films from 1978 onwards, because obviously you can't look at the entire 20th century. Yeah. And yeah, there's definitely been a trend in recent years towards saying it was true, as if that's going to somehow make it scarier.
You said you can't cover the entire 20th century, but I mean, there have been from way back a lot of haunted house movies. Why do you think people like to watch them? Is it a sort of vicarious thrill that, you know, wouldn't it be awful if we had a ghost at home, but we can shiver at someone else's discomfort?
I think there's several different reasons. I think for some people, they like the idea of being scared by a film, but they really don't like gore. So my mother's one of these people. She hates gory films. Not that she doesn't like gore, she just finds it unnecessary. Yeah. And then you've got other people who maybe have an interest in the supernatural, and I think that's the thing. You know, obviously, if you're more interested in like true crime, you're more likely to watch slasher films and serial killer films, whereas if you're more interested in the supernatural, you're going to tend more towards haunted house films. But I think what's quite interesting is you've also got like the haunted house at the theme park effect as well, where
of course,
it's not real. Yeah, so you get to enjoy the scare.
Yes.
And because there's no definitive proof that the supernatural exists or whatever, you know, you can scare yourself with that like rational thought in the back of your head of, oh, this is just CGI, whereas obviously with something like a serial killer film, they do exist. So I think it's a different thing that attracts people to those films.
Yes, I've forgotten about the theme park thing. I mean, that even goes back to ghost trains of earlier eras, the same thing. Yeah. All right. How has the genre evolved over the years? Has it changed? Do we want things scarier, or has the supernatural or the horror element changed?
I think one of the things that people, and this might be a mass generalisation, but I think one of the things that hasn't changed is people they like the ability to use their imagination. So if you look at, for example, the original version of The Haunting from 1963, the two most effective scenes in that, you've no idea what's going on the other side of the door. And whatever you imagine as a viewer is going to be quite personal to you. So it's almost like they're withholding the reveal of the whatever it is, be it a monster or a ghost or whatever. And I think that's one of the reasons why the Paranormal Activity films did so well. Yeah. Because you never actually see the presence. And you can get away with doing it. I mean, obviously Poltergeist did. But then if you go to the other end of the spectrum and you get a film like Insidious, where you do see the spectral forms, they at least then, while yes, they're not scary because you can see them, because they use such an interesting use of design and costume and all that kind of thing, it makes them not scary, but it just makes them creepy.
Yes.
Because they look so unnatural. So I think on one hand, there is that continual desire to see. And I mean, that's why people watch things like Ghost Hunters International or Haunted Collector or whatever it might be. People want to see something supernatural and they want to see something paranormal. But at the same time, not seeing it is almost scarier. So it's like, you know, that creaking floorboard upstairs when you're in the house on your own is infinitely more scary than, you know, a whole load of other things that might happen.
Yes.
So I think, in a way, the genre has changed. But I don't know if that's just because the filmmakers are trying to second guess what the viewer wants.
Right.
And they think, oh, we need to have big set pieces. We've got a budget, let's spend it. And I think if I look at, and the interesting one is if you look at the original Amityville Horror with the remake, the remake's way gorier and it doesn't need to be.
Yeah.
And obviously there's hundreds and hundreds of shots of Ryan Reynolds with no top on, which adds nothing to the narrative at all. But I suppose it's quite good for marketing. But, you know, if you then look at what they did with the Poltergeist remake, on the other hand, they actually remembered the whole point of it's about the house, it's about the family. And yes, they did use special effects, but they used them quite sparingly. So at least, you know, they preserved, you know, the feel of the first one, whereas, yeah, Amityville kind of went down the, ooh, let's just scare some 15-year-olds, which
Yeah.
I don't think any 15-year-old was scared by that film.
What is, you mentioned 15-year-olds, but what is the typical age group who go to see movies, haunted house movies, when they come out on first release, as opposed to jaded people like me who buy them on a DVD 6 months later?
I'm not really sure. I mean, I know because I don't go to see all of them at the cinema because I already know they're going to be awful. So I think, well, I'll watch them on Sky.
Yeah.
But I think the last few that I've been to see at the cinema, actually, it's either been people in their late 20s, early 30s who have obviously grown up with these kind of films, or it's people in their teens. And I remember when I went to see The Woman in Black 2, Angel of Death, which I had such high hopes for. And, you know, I was disappointed is all I'm going to say. But there was a group of lads, there might have been about 6 of them, further along the road from where I was sitting. And they were quite clearly scared, but they were doing that typical thing of, oh, well, we'll just be loud and obnoxious and, you know, talk out loud during the film and, like, shout things at the screen to hide the fact that we're scared.
I got you.
And it just... Yeah, and at one point I ended up having to use the teacher voice, and I'm like, when you've quite finished, because they were then spoiling the atmosphere, what atmosphere there was for everyone else.
Yeah.
So I do think, I mean, I know I've been, I think it was when I went to see The Woman in Black on stage, and I've actually seen that twice now. And the second time I went, there was a whole group of teenagers in. And oh my God, they were squealing and everything, which made it quite funny for the rest of the audience who didn't find it that scary. So it actually added to the experience. But I do think that there is almost that element of, oh, let's go and see a scary film and let's see who actually gets scared.
Yeah.
Whereas with sort of like my age group of like early 30s, it's more kind of please be good, please be good, please be good. So I think that's the difference.
Yeah. You mentioned Woman in Black. Do you class that as a haunted house?
Yes.
Yeah.
I love the book. The book's awesome.
Yeah, it is.
Susan Hill's one of my favourite authors. And she's awesome because she replies to you on Twitter, which is quite nice. But I love the book, and I love the stage play. It's fantastic. And in a way, it's far more atmospheric than any film ever could be.
Yeah.
But I did quite like what they did with the film. The first one, I think Daniel Radcliffe held it together remarkably well.
Yeah.
But the sequel, somebody had obviously been watching too much J-horror and decided that they were going to sort of like try and create a mythos. And it's like, but they kind of missed the point a little bit.
Yeah, yeah. Mentioning that, what would be your favourite 5 or the most important, in your point of view, haunted house movies in recent times?
In recent times, it's quite hard because I try and think of all the ones that have come out in about the last 5 years have been a bit naff.
Stretch it back further then. Go back further.
I must admit, I am going to have to say The Conjuring, the first one, is really good.
Yeah.
Because it's one of the few haunted house films that I've seen where I actually wanted the family to do well, because most the families in most haunted house films are so irritating, you don't really care what happens to them. But with the way that they characterised the Perron family, they were actually nice and you actually liked them. I am going to have to say the Poltergeist remake, purely because of what they did with the use of technology, and that was really interesting.
Yeah.
The others would be a really good option, which, as far as ghost house and haunted house films go, for me, can't really be topped.
Yeah.
Although that means you do have to go back to 2001 for that one. And the other one, I'm going to have to go back to the 90s for this one. But Ghostwatch from the BBC.
I was going to ask you about that, yeah.
Yeah, it's phenomenal. And it's amazing that I went so long, because I was only 9 when that was on. And it was only a few years ago that I heard about it, and somebody made us watch it. And I'm like, oh my God, this is amazing. This is absolutely fantastic. Yeah. And then I found out why it had never been shown on TV.
Yes. I was going to say it had a sort of an Orson Welles Invaders from Mars type thing, that a lot of people took it seriously and been very distressed by it, because it recently celebrated its 25th anniversary of being shown earlier this autumn, I think it was.
And I think as well, something like that would be phenomenal. They could never do it again. It's very much one of those one-time only deals, but it would be fantastic to see if something like that would work now, because of the fact that you wouldn't have people necessarily phoning in, you'd have people tweeting them.
Yes.
So it would be quite funny to see what the difference would be with the way people engage with TV. And of course, because people tape things to watch them later now, how many people actually sit down to watch something as it's aired?
Yeah.
So that would really lose its impact if you were then watching it on iPlayer like 3 weeks later. So I think and there's a lot of reasons why I think that one really worked. And I think one of the things I found interesting about it, obviously other than the fact that everyone's playing themselves, which gave it that wonderful air of authenticity, it's because of the way that most haunted house films deal with, this big rambling house that's isolated or in the middle of nowhere. And even the films like the Paranormal Activity films, they're not in the middle of nowhere, they're still in the suburbs, but they're still detached houses, not actually attached to the neighbouring houses and so on. But everyone seems to own the house.
Yeah.
And that's one of the reasons why the J horror films are quite interesting, because obviously people tend to rent. And that was the thing that I think made Ghostwatch so interesting, the fact that it was this ordinary council house.
Yeah.
It could not have been more mundane.
Lovely. Sort of final question. Have you ever stayed in a haunted house?
I have. I used to do, when I first moved back from London 6 years ago, I was part of a company that did overnight paranormal investigations.
Oh, right.
And so we sort of went to places that, obviously around the northeast. And we did more than I can remember in Newcastle's Castle Keep. We did a few in the Black Gate. We went up to Jedburgh Jail for one. We did Washington Old Hall, a lighthouse, and a few various places like that. And you were only there until about 2:00 in the morning. And obviously everybody was split into teams, and, you used all the different tools and all that kind of thing. Obviously, it's one of those kind of things where you can't substantiate anything. So you can't sort of definitively say, oh, this happened, oh, this place is haunted or whatever. But you can sort of definitely point to personal experiences and say, this was weird, I can't explain this. So, this is the thing. I'm the kind of person where if I'm going on holiday somewhere, I'm kind of like, oh my God, have they got a haunted room in the hotel? I want to stay in that one. Because I'm a bit like Mike Enslin in 1408, where he's looking for paranormal stuff.
Yeah.
So it's like, I'd really just love to experience something terrifying just to prove it's real. That I'm the kind of weird person who would be like, yeah, I'll have the room that nobody else will stay in.
And I take it then you didn't personally have any supernatural experiences in these haunted houses?
Oh, I definitely did.
You did?
It's
right.
they're the kind of things that when you look back on them, you're like, did that really happen? The weirdest one, which was quite cool because it ties into me being a writer, was at Kielder Castle, obviously in Kielder Forest, like literally in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah.
And it was quite funny because one of the attic rooms is just sort of full of like old rusty blades and equipment and like bits of chainsaw and stuff. And one of the team leaders was like, "Oh, if there's anything present in the room, could you throw something?" And I'm like, "Preferably not one of the chainsaw blades." But no, it was downstairs. We were on the Ouija board. Mm-hmm. And there was me and the team leader and then these 3 people, and they'd never met me before in their life. And we obviously had the Ouija board, and they'd had their own experience with it. And then all of a sudden we got, like a hello, and oh, hello, who are you? And we sort of said, like, have you got a message for anyone here? And it actually spelled out my real name, not my pen name. Mm-hmm. And obviously these people at Kielder only knew my pen name, so they were like, "Well, who is this person?" Because they didn't know who that was. We were like, "Just go with it." Mm-hmm. And then we said, "Who is it?" And it actually spelled out the first name of my main character in my westerns that I write. And I was like, "Okay, this is weird." And then I kind of went, "Have you got a message?" And he went, "Yes." And I was like, "Okay, then what is it?" Spelled out "thank you." And I was like, "You're welcome." Like, what for? Sort of playing along with it. And then it spelled out "life," and I was like, "Oh my God." And of course the people on the board were like, literally, "We have no idea what's going on. What do these answers mean?" And they were a bit freaked out because they were like, "Well, what the hell is this? Like, who are these people? Who is this person passing on a message? And why does she look so freaked out and everything?" And it was just the fact that when I sort of said to whatever the spirit was, and I was like, "Thank you very much, no problem. You're welcome." And then it went to goodbye, and it was so polite. And my character in my westerns, he's very well mannered, and he's brought up properly. And I thought, my God, that's the kind of thing you probably would do. So that was definitely weird. But of course, I didn't find it scary. It was more just, what's going on? This is really bizarre.
That's brilliant. Okay, I see. Thanks ever so much indeed. That was brilliant.
No problem. Cheers.
Find us online at www.urbanfantasist.com or email us at urbanfantasist@icloud.com.
Don't you just hate it when you lend someone a book and you never get it back? Or else you find a book in a second-hand shop you fancy, and then you see it's been defaced by someone writing in the margins or underlining sections in bright yellow marker pen.
And that's just with modern mass-produced paperbacks. It was so much worse in the Middle Ages, before printing had come to Europe. The process of creating a book, or even making a copy of an existing book, could take months, and in some instances years. A scribe would bend over his copy table, illuminated only by natural light. Candles were too big a risk for the books, and spend hours each day forming the letters by hand, careful never to make an error. To be a copyist, wrote one scribe, was painful. It extinguishes the light from the eyes, it bends the back, it crushes the viscera and the ribs, and brings forth pain to the kidneys and weariness to the whole body. Do you know, I feel like that eating my breakfast while reading my iPad in the morning. True.
In the circumstances, it's hardly surprising that given the extreme effort that went into creating these books, many scribes and book owners would write, at the beginning or end of books, dramatic curses threatening thieves with pain and suffering if they were to steal or damage a book. Here's a few of our favourites.
Right. If anyone take away this book, let him die the death. Let him be roasted in a frying pan. Let the falling sickness and fever seize him. Let him be broken on the wheel and hanged. Amen. See, zero tolerance. That's where I feel we went wrong. Too easygoing, especially at libraries.
Definitely. I think torture racks outside libraries should be brought in by local authorities immediately.
Your turn.
Who folds a leaf down, the devil makes brown. Who makes mark or blot, the devil toasts hot. Who steals this book, the devil shall cook.
Yeah, okay. So, here's another one. Steal not this book, my honest friend, for fear the gallows should be your end. And when you die, the Lord will say, and where's the book you stole away?
Slightly more serious one here. For him that stealeth or borroweth and returneth not, this book from its owner, let it change into a serpent in his hand and rend him. Let him be struck by palsy and all his members blasted. Ooh. Let him languish in pain, crying aloud for mercy, and let there be no end to his agony till he sing in dissolution. Let the bookworms gnaw his entrails, in token for the worm that dieth not. And when at last he goeth to his final punishment, let the flames of hell consume him forever.
And finally, this book belongs to none but me, for there's my name inside to see. To steal this book, if you should try, it's by the throat you'll hang high. And ravens then will gather about to find your eyes and pull them out. And when you're screaming, oh, 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 remember, you deserved this woe. Now that's harsh but fair, I feel.
I think so,
Yes.
definitely. Although the sad story of the Lowestoft witches only involved 2 poor women, it turned out to be one of the most influential witch trials in English history and had major ramifications when the precedent it set was followed in the Salem witch trials. We're going now to be talking to Hugh Aldersey Williams. Hugh is a writer. His most recent book is Tide, about the tides at the sea, and he's also the author of The Adventures of Sir Thomas Browne in the 21st Century. Hugh, one of your most recent books is The Adventures of Sir Thomas Browne in the 21st Century. For people who aren't familiar with Thomas Browne, can you give us a quick nutshell? How would you describe him?
Well, he was interested in everything. He was a physician by profession, and he lived in Norwich in the 17th century. And he tended sort of rich and poor and Cavalier and Roundhead in the whole county of Norfolk, in fact, over much of that time, through the Civil War period and so on. But he was also a writer, and he's the writer of some of the greatest prose in the English language, not much read now, unfortunately, but very fine essays. People weren't using the word science then, or scientific, but phenomena that we would now think of as scientific. He would investigate in sort of experimental ways.
But given that, if you like, scientific background, what we're going to talk about now is the sort of curious case of the 2 Lowestoft witches, where he gave evidence at the witch trial in Bury St Edmunds, and it's notable that this was quite a late witch trial. It was in the Restoration period as opposed to 20 years earlier when the Witchfinder General was around. And it seems quite, his evidence was very influential in the conviction, and it seems odd that a man of science should also be believing in witchcraft. Can you tell us a little bit more about that, the case?
Well, as I say, the word science wasn't yet current. There was no such thing as a scientist. So Thomas Browne was a natural philosopher to some extent, but he was also a man of his time and a devout Christian, and someone who was not interested in upsetting the apple cart. He trod a very careful path during the whole troubled Civil War period, not sort of picking sides, just quietly ploughing his furrow as a physician. So he wasn't a kind of avant-garde figure of any sort, despite his interest in science, if you like. As I say, he was curious about things, and he wrote a long, his longest book was something called Pseudodoxia Epidemica, which means basically widely believed old wives' tales, and he debunked. So, I mean, just to give one very quick example, people believe that if you hang a kingfisher up by its beak, in the wind, it will tell you which way the wind is blowing.
So, at the witch trial, his evidence was very much that he believed there was an element of witchcraft involved.
Well, you have to be a bit careful. The witch trial is a kind of has a rather unsatisfactory account, so we're not very sure what happened.
Right.
And Thomas Browne's involvement was fairly minimal. So the trial happened in 1662, as you say, in Bury St Edmunds, although the witches themselves were from the Lowestoft, as were their accusers. And the account of the trial that is our only source for what happened there, didn't appear until 20 years later, and is anonymous and came by a sort of circuitous route. So we're not quite sure of its origins or legitimacy.
Right.
But nevertheless, it says that Browne gave, maybe evidence is not the right word, but was asked to speak at this trial, and he said that the children who are, we should explain that there are two accused women, Amy Denny and Rose Cullender, and they are two widows from Lowestoft, and they have been accused by the families of several children who have been allegedly bewitched and anyway have suffered one form or another of some ailment or illness or psychological problem, as we would now describe it. And in those days it was fitting and swoons and all this kind of language. So that's the background to the story. Browne says that he declares, using his medical professional opinion, that the children are indeed bewitched. He doesn't say who bewitched them.
Yeah.
But the only two people on trial in the court on the day were these two women, and those kinds of trials being what they were at that time, of course they were found guilty.
Yeah.
But Browne himself believed in witches, and he repeatedly declared his belief in witches both before and after that trial. He never wrote about the trial, so it doesn't seem to have preyed on his conscience or anything. And he believed in witches, as a lot of people did, even into the later 17th century, because it was a kind of way of enforcing social cohesion. It was a sort of common enemy, if you like, that people could say, yes, we all don't like witches. So it helps society go here if everyone can agree to dislike something in common. And that's the sort of Hobbesian idea behind belief in the devil and his witches.
Right, because 1662 was just into the Restoration, and they'd only just finished dealing with regicides, and there was still obviously a lot of soreness from the Cromwellian period in the Civil War, so that makes a lot of sense.
Yes, I think so. That's right. It's a conservative turn, and people, those kinds of values are more on the resurgent. Yeah.
Now the judge involved was Sir Matthew Hale, who was equivalent today of a High Court judge, a senior judge, as opposed to just a local magistrate. And I see in your book you make a reference that says that if the 1662 trial we've just been talking about hadn't taken place, the witch trials in Salem 30 years later would also have not taken place. That sort of the one provided, if you like, the legal background for the movers behind the scene.
Yeah, I don't think it would have been prosecuted in the same manner, it appears, because the conduct of the trial in Bury was taken as a kind of template for the one in Salem, yes.
What was the aspect of it then that was the influence? Because it was very much Cotton Mathers was saying there was a certain way you should conduct a witch trial, but you didn't actually need to have, if you like, evidence of witchcraft being shown in court. Or how did that fit in?
There was this phenomenon called spectral evidence. It was a sense of an unfortunate aura, I suppose, that hung around these accused people. But, the damage is done when they're accused and dragged before the court rather than through the existence of any kind of phenomenon like this. So I think, that there is that sort of element of the madness of crowds that creeps in, the sort of hysteria of the population that, sets things on this inevitable course.
It's been suggested that the character of Sir Matthew Fell in the M.R. James ghost story, The Ash Tree, is based on Brown. It's set in the same time, and it's a squire who reluctantly gives evidence at a witch trial, and he subsequently comes to an unhappy end. That didn't happen to Thomas Brown, but he did have his body did have some strange adventures after his death, didn't he? They lost his head for some time.
They did, yes. So Thomas Brown's a sort of funny person in the sense that aspects of his life that he anticipates in a way come back to bite him on the tail. And the most notable example is that he was born on the 19th of October 1605, most likely. The absolute date's not clear because they've recorded christening dates rather than birth dates and so on. And he died on the 19th of October 1682 on his birthday. But what is interesting is that he wrote about people who die on their birthdays before he actually did. He called this a remarkable coincidence. That's his quote. And we still don't know, actually, whether it's a remarkable coincidence to die on your birthday or not. So, what proportion of people would you expect to die on their birthdays? Is it just 1 in 365 because your birthday is just one other day in the year? Or is it more than that because of the excitement, or less than that because you try to live whatever? So, statisticians still disagree about that question. So that's one example of how his kind of, he anticipates odd things that come to affect him themselves. But the story you're talking about is he was buried in the centre of Norwich, in the main parish church of Norwich, St Peter Mancroft, in 1682, as I say. And then in the mid-19th century, that grave was disturbed because they were doing some building work in Norwich. And the whole site was dug up, and his skeleton became separated from his skull. And his skull was taken as a kind of medical souvenir by a surgeon from the Norfolk and Norwich Hospital and carted off there. And whether he used it for sort of anatomical demonstrations or just as a kind of trophy, I don't know. And it resided there for a very long time, and the best part of a century, until 1922, when the church finally won a kind of long battle to get it back. And when they got it back finally in 1922, they reburied it with the skeleton with all due ceremony. And Brown's age is recorded in the church register as 317 because of that.
That's priceless. Hugh, been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much indeed.
Good, you're very welcome.
Almost time to go, but before we do, here's a creepy story to give you nightmares. And like all the best creepy stories, it's absolutely true, and it happened to me. One day, during the summer holidays, when I was a kid growing up in Scarborough, there was a time when I was about to cycle over to an area on the outskirts of the town called Forge Valley. I happened to mention it to my grandmother, just as I'd picked up an apple It was a Granny Smith, the only variety of apple we ever had in the house, to take with me on the trip. "You're not going to Forge Valley with an apple, are you?" she asked. Only when I was a little girl, there was a boy in my class at school who did just that, but then disappeared and was never seen again. And, just like you, he'd set off with a fresh green Granny Smith apple in his pocket. "Whatever happened next?" asked my mother, who was also in the room, as if there was any chance of stopping my grandmother once she'd embarked on one of her reminiscences. "I've forgotten the boy's name," she said, "but it seems he went for a walk through the woods one Sunday afternoon in winter, slipped on an icy piece of rock, tumbled down a small cliff and cracked his head open on a rock. Nobody knows whether the fall killed him, but if he didn't, the cold hard frost that night would have carried him off from exposure." "And then what?" I prompted. "Well, naturally, when he didn't show up for school the following week, everyone began wondering what had happened. Then we learned his mother had reported him missing to the police, so we knew it was serious. But the days turned into weeks, and the weeks turned into months, but nary a hide nor hair of him could ever be found. Eventually the story became old news, and some gossip suggested that he'd probably run away to sea or gone off to join a circus. Yes, listeners, apparently people really did run away to join the circus in those days." My grandmother continued, "And that would have been the end of the story, except about 15 years later, a young Tommy was home on leave." This incidentally was during the First World War, when British soldiers were referred to as Tommies. This young Tommy was walking through Forge Valley one autumn afternoon when he spotted a splendid apple tree spreading up from the foot of a small cliff. The tree was hanging up with fruit, but what caught his eye was the fact these were not the usual crab apples you see in the countryside, but large, green, round, plump Granny Smiths. Naturally he went over to pick some and scrambled down the cliff so he could reach the fruit on the lower branches. But then he saw it. "Saw what?" my mother and I asked almost simultaneously. "It was a skeleton," said my grandmother. "The skeleton of a young boy, the bones all exposed and bleached white. However, they were able to identify him because the remains of his school cap were still on his bony little skull, and his name, written on the inner lining in Indian ink, was still legible. But, and here's the most gruesome part of the story," said my grandmother, "the trunk of the apple tree was growing up through the skeleton's rib cage. They reckoned that as the poor mite's body decomposed, his rotting flesh made a perfect mulch for the apple in his pocket, the seeds of which sprouted, took root, and eventually grew into an apple tree." Janie and I will be back on Thursday the 21st of December, just in time for this year's winter solstice, with more weird tales from the world of ghosts, folklore, urban legends, witchcraft and magic. But in the meantime, good night.
Black Shuck, the demon dog of East Anglia, is baying at the moon. Which means it's time for us to go. You've been listening to Urban Fantasist with Charles Christian, your fortnightly fix of weird tales, urban legends, magic and folklore. Keep in touch with us online at www.urbanfantasist.com, by email to urbanfantasist@icloud.com. Good night. Join us again in 2 weeks' time for another edition of Urban Fantasist.